now it's time for discussion. Takže, ako dobre viete, za chvíľu vám dám priestor na vaše otázky. Len pripomeniem pravidlá, ktoré tu panujú v rámci tejto diskusie. Každý, kto má záujem, môže sa prihlásiť. Potom dám pokyn a mikrofón poputuje k vám, asistenta. A môžete sa dobrovoľne predstaviť, nemusíte, je to dobrovoľné, ale poprosím vás, aby ste povedali, či budete sa pýtať, alebo teda dáte nejaký námed v slovenčine alebo v angličtine, aby pán profesor sa mohol pripraviť s tlmočníckou straničkou. A prosím, využite čas maximálne 2 minúty, aby zostalo čo najviac priestoru na čo najväčší počet záujemcov. Takže nech sa páči, v prvom rade som videl niekoho. Dohodnite sa. Mikrofón poputuje k vám. Už Ivan v prvom rade je tu otázka. A opakujem, nech sa páči.
Hi, I'm Thomas. My question will be in English, or a couple of questions. You must be very unpopular at cocktail parties, by the way. I knew all this stuff, yet you depressed me. But 2 questions. I guess first, I was wondering how you were talking about the type 2 monetary mistake. I was wondering how that would work mechanically, because what I naively assumed was if the central bank interest rate is set too high, the commercial banks can always issue credit at a lower rate, and that should have no impact. And then my second question was, do you expect, or do you think there's a scenario where the central bank takes the right set of steps, like with Paul Volcker in the early 80s? And if not, what do you anticipate to happen? Is it more of a like creeping continuous high inflation, or more of a zombification of the economy, or some combination of both?
Okay, so the first question is about the response of commercial banks. The implicit assumption is that the commercial banks sooner or later always have to follow the key interest rate of the central bank, and I think that's a realistic assumption. If a central bank cuts the interest rate, the commercial banks will cut the interest rate as well. But if the central bank increases the interest rate, that should also have a respective impact on the credit market. And that was empirically, for the periods which I showed here, also the case. So, of course, it's not a one-to-one relationship, but the tendency is right. So now the 2 scenarios. Scenario number 1 is a gradual exit strategy. So you asked about the likelihood. That's at least what's announced by the Federal Reserve Bank. And so the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, the representatives have increasingly announced aggressively to lift interest rates. And the last statement I read was that they are willing to increase the interest rate until the interest rate is higher than the inflation rate. Yeah? And that would be a kind of Volcker type response. Of course, we don't know how credible this is, because the more we increase interest rates, the more there's a risk that we have again bursting bubbles in the real estate market. The prices in the real estate market today in the United States are much higher than at the peak of the subprime boom. There might be financial market crisis and so on, and that may be taken as an incentive to cut interest rates again and to return to the original low interest rate quantitative easing monetary policy. Yeah, and that brings us directly to scenario number 2. So what happens if we return to this persistent low interest rate quantitative easing policy? And that's mainly, in my view, the central bank is buying everything. Yeah, we are buying more and more government bonds, and the more government bonds we buy, the larger will be the activity of the government in the economy. So the government will crowd out the private enterprises, but of course also directly the central bank can buy the stocks and it can buy the real estate credit, the asset-backed securities and so on. and that would be equivalent to a gradual move into a planning economy, like, not by revolution, but by step. And I'm not sure. I'm quite sure that the continental European countries are willing to do that, but I'm not sure if the United States would be willing to do that. There are always influential people behind the scene which make the decisions, and I'm not sure if the Americans are really willing to do that, because then that would also detrimental to the wealth of the very rich in the United States, and we have to deal with the redistribution being a very important factor when in election campaigns and so on. So I think the judgment is out, from my point of view, with a 50-50 probability in the one or the other direction.
My response to the question will be in English. So when you spoke about the credit allocation and how the European Bank or some multinational entities step in to print the money, basically, what happens with private investors? Because at what point does the bank says that they don't want to deal with your savings as a client because it's too much work for them, they can just go to the mama bank and basically get the money. And if that happens, then what happens with the private investor? Because there's no way to depreciate his savings.
Made the argument that the European Central Bank is gradually crowding out the private banks, yeah, by depressing the interest rate margin, or now the TLTRO credit mainly means that the European Central Bank is crowding out the credit business of the private banks. With one main difference, the private banks were able to make an assessment about the profitability of the future investment projects, because they are close to the enterprises, the small and medium banks, and were able to gather the respective information, but the European Central Bank will not be able to do this. Yeah? So how should the ECB in Frankfurt know what the profitability of investment project in Western Bulgaria would be? That's not possible, and therefore more and more political criteria will lead the credit allocation of the European Central Bank, and the taxonomy is there, and there's a very powerful lobbying process ongoing, how the taxonomy is done. So now atomic industry is good for the environment. That's astonishing from the point of view of the Germans, but that's how it is, and soon the atomic enterprises of France will get credit, subsidized credit from the ECB, maybe. And interestingly, a small green investment is not eligible for a TLTRO credit, only green investment of large corporations. So we have also a very strong concentration process, and that is an impediment for competition.
My name is Juraj. I'm also asking English. I would like to ask what happens if people start saving in a different currency, for example, gold or Bitcoin, and virtual interest rate, meaning how their purchasing power is preserved, is different than with the savings rate of the banks. So you would have two curves for savings. One is for example, in euros, and one is in Bitcoin, let's say, or gold.
I think that's two things. So if people sell euros or dollars and buy bitcoins, of course the value of the bitcoin is increasing and the value of the dollar relative to the bitcoin is declining. And despite the recent sharp decline of bitcoin, that's the trend which we have in many years. I think the credit business is a different one. I can give to an entrepreneur credit in terms of euros or in terms of Bitcoin, but in both cases I would expect an interest rate. Yeah? And maybe if I am free to charge an interest rate in the case of credit provision in Bitcoin, I would like to provide a credit in terms of Bitcoin, and maybe the entrepreneur would take it, but of course there's very strong competition from the European Central Bank, which offers a credit at -1. I wouldn't do it at -1.
Sa páči, vnem vzadu.
V slovenčine by som sa chcel opýtať. Občania nemajú radi infláciu, pretože požierajú úspory a spôsobujú ďalšie problémy. Napriek tomu ženú politikov k tomu, aby tú infláciu prehlbovali. Ale dajme tomu, že by sa našiel nejaký...
So that didn't work, but Peter can translate.
Môžete zopakovať?
Takže občania nemajú radi infláciu, pretože požiera ich úspory a spôsobujú ďalšie problémy. Ale napriek tomu ženú politikov k tomu, aby tú infláciu prehlbovali. Dajme tomu, že by sa našiel nejaký osvietený politik, ktorý by išiel proti tomuto prúdu. Čo by podľa vás mohol urobiť? Už ste naznačil, že prestane mrať štátnymi peniazmi. To ste naznačil, to je jedna vec. A ešte, čo by ešte taký osvietený politik mal urobiť? Ďakujem.
The question is concerning an enlightened politician who is trying to stop all this. Yeah? Currently, I don't see such a politician in Europe. But if I would have the task to do that, I would first act behind the scene and put the responsibility to start the process to the central bank. Yeah? So if a central bank starts to increase the interest rate, yeah, for instance, Paul Volcker all of a sudden came. Yeah, the old central bank president, the term was not terminated, but he was away, and a new one came. Yeah, and if a new central banker comes instead of Christine Lagarde, for instance, Gunther Schnabl, yeah, he would lift the interest rate. Yeah, and as soon as the ECB is mad enough to lift the interest rate, there would be no choice for the policymakers, yeah, to do the respective consolidation of government expenditure in order to align the fiscal policy with the monetary policy. Because what we currently have in the euro area is overburdened expenditure obligations of all governments in the euro area, more or less, but most more, yeah. And therefore we have a very expansionary monetary policy, and if you want to take away the burden from monetary policy, the first step is fiscal consolidation. Yeah? By the way, Ron McKinnon, he did a lot of research on the economic order of financial liberalization, and he said the first step is consolidating government expenditure, and once you have consolidated government expenditure, you can also consolidate monetary policy, but that does not exclude that the pressure comes from a respective announcement from the central banker. And then the politicians can put the blame on the central banker. And the central banker is independent and they have to do it. Yeah. So last week, I just made a sentence in Germany that if this is going on, the pension entry age will have to be lifted to 70 years because the social system of Germany will not be sustainable. And the pensioners were very angry on me, yeah, because I announced reforms, yeah. And it's very funny, they are not affected because they are already pensioners, but anyway, they were very angry on me. So if you are doing reforms, you need a blame guy. I think the central bank gets that's one.
What about lightening the central bankers? Lightening central bankers. for example, how to stop quantitative easing and purchasing of government bonds by central bank, how to reach it.
Yeah, so just the right person.
Or currency competition.
Or currency competition, yeah, that would be an avoid. Bitcoin is really becoming powerful and they are not able to regulate Bitcoin down, that's likely, then they may be forced to change their policy.
Nech sa páči, teraz skúsme v druhom rade a potom pôjdeme zase ďalej.
Thank you for the enlightening lecture. My name is Pavel and I will pose my question in English. The debate seems to revolve about having the right person on either a European level or a national level, but are the national states still in charge of actually having the ability to change their fiscal policy with the recovery plan and the qualitative change in how they basically receive European funds. Now they have milestones and reforms, and some of the states, for example, Czech Republic or Slovakia, they rely on the funds, and it sets their agenda of the government. So that would be my question, like, is there still someone who can actually change the course of action, or the machinery is already in place towards more EU level centralization? Thank you.
So that's already a state-directed economy because everybody hopes for the funds. Yeah. In Eastern Germany, which has a very weak economic structure, if you go to the small cities or the villages, everybody's waiting for the funds from the state. But the very problem is, whatever you do, the funds are restricted, yeah, and therefore the funds are usually going only to small parts of the country or the European Union, and it depends on political decisions where the funds are going. And they're going to some places which are very happy, and they're going not to other places which are very unhappy. And the very problem with the funds is that the money has to be collected, yeah? And then the question is, how is it collected? So nobody talks about, of course, about the collection of the funds. There are two ways to do that. The first one is to raise taxes. I haven't heard European policymakers talking about tax increases for a very long time. And the very reason is that they raise debt and they have to get used that the debt will be purchased by the European Central Bank. Yeah? And that also means that at the end of the day, the funds are collected in the stores because the prices are going up. For a very long time, the funds were collected by real estate markets, by rising real estate prices. Now they are collected in the stores, and that means you withdraw funds from many regions, put it into the government, and then the government distributes the funds to few regions, very big clusters. Yeah? And that's increasing inequality. Yeah? And that's also making many regions in Europe desperate. Yeah? Because the government, the only thing the government is doing is to extract purchasing power from the regions and put it to some economic centers, which of course are very happy.
Páči, videl som ruku. No, sa to dáva, no. Áno. A tej ruky je viac, takže vydržte chvíľu.
Thank you. My name is John Gal. I will pose a question in English as well. The question is going to the inflation target of the European Central Bank and the interpretation of it. Because I think it's a key question, how we will interpret. It has only one target, unlike the US Fed, and that's inflation of 2%. Now, it might be interpreted as inflation below 2% in short term, or as inflation at 2% in short term, or as inflation of on average of 2% in a longer term, like 2 years, 5-year, 10-year period, or there might be some goals to lift this inflation target, arguing that most of the inflation is exported from abroad through energy prices, so let's make it more flexible and lift it to 3 or 4%. So what do you think? What will be optional, optimal according to you, and what is more likely? Thank you.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. So the inflation target has changed. So the legal basis of the inflation target is the treaty on the functioning of the European Union, and here the goal of the European Central Bank is price stability, and that means the price level is stable, horizontal, in my interpretation. Okay, fluctuate, but price stability means a stable price level. So the first formulation of the inflation target was a maximum of 2%. Yeah? And that meant, okay, it can go up and we can not really measure inflation, but price stability means for us a maximum of 2%, but not more. Then in 2003, with Trichet, that was changed to a point target saying we want 2%, not more and not less, close to 2%, and that already meant we wanted the price levels going up. And that's, in my interpretation, already the first violation of the price stability goal as embedded in the treaty. And in addition, there was a very funny constellation because they said we want a point target of 1.9%, under but close to 2%. Now the inflation rate sometimes was 1% or 0.5%, and all of a sudden they argued it's too low. It's not 0.2%, it's 1%, and because it's too low, we have to buy billions of government bonds. Yeah? And the next step was now 2021, saying we want inflation over the medium term, 2%. Now it's symmetric, right? Not a point, and they argue we get low inflation for some years, so it can go up above 2% for some years, maybe for 1 percentage point, but now the incident is that it went up to 7.5%, and it's far beyond the target, and the response of Lagarde is, let's talk about something else. Yeah? Let's talk about the greening of the economy, or let's talk about the virus, or women's rights, or whatever, but please don't talk about the inflation targets. Yeah? And the funny thing is that there will be no constitutional court in Europe where you can challenge this attitude. And in my view, that's clearly eroding the credibility of the European Central Bank and the credibility of the European institutions, because if they cannot stick to the treaty, so the treaty has no value.
Teraz poďme dozadu, nech sa páči, tam vidím ruku.
My name is Igor. I have like a theoretical question. I don't know much about the theory. I heard. So how would it work when could it work that the central bank will not determine the interest rate at all? That it would be determined by some market forces, by the tendency of people to save and tendency of people to invest, maybe. And the other question, or maybe connected, what do you think would be the natural interest rate, and how does it change when the society gets richer?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So your first question is easy, supply and demand. Yeah. So there was a long time in history where there were no central banks. Yeah. And the interest rates were negotiated on the market, full stop, and that was possible. Yeah? And of course, the interest rate will depend on supply and demand on the capital market. So now the second question is, where is the natural interest rate? That's a very difficult question because it's unknown. Yeah? But it will be certainly positive. So there's because it reflects time preferences. Nobody will borrow out money if he gets less back. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, and that's not in line with human nature, let's say. And the third part of the question is that indeed, there were now in the literature in economics several attempts to estimate the natural interest rate. Yeah? Interestingly, this literature is coming out from the central banks, from the research departments from the central banks, and they all find that indeed, in line with the key interest rates of the central banks, the natural interest rates are declining. Yeah? But I can tell you as an economist, the outcome of a model always depends on the specification of the model.
Sa páči, kto ďalší má záujem v druhom rade, vidím, druhý rad.
Hello, my name is Roman. I will ask in English. First of all, thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting and also with the person. So let me just ask you, do you think you will see in your lifetime dissolution of the European Monetary Union? And if so, do you expect it will start from one of the responsible countries, like the Germany, because they will not be able or willing to pay for the whole party anymore, or from the side from one of the irresponsible countries like Italy, because they will be also unwilling or unable to service the debt without, manipulating their currency independently? Thank you.
That's again a very good question. So I'm not sure. Yeah, we could well experience a kind of quasi-nationalization of the whole European continent. I think that's not unlikely. I think political leaders and also the population in the western part of Europe seem to be very keen to do that. Yeah, and they have many reasons why this is necessary. So, as I have read Hayek, the loss of economic freedom is always linked to the loss of personal freedom, and therefore I would say this process would be in conflict with the constitutions which we have in Western Europe, because we have liberal free constitutions which have to be in line with market economies. And that would be a big challenge. So I hope that given a growing political polarization, at some point of time a kind of European Margaret Thatcher would show up and end this exercise or enterprise. And I would say that currency competition in Europe before the euro was a very productive thing. Yeah? So we had the northern European countries with a stability-oriented monetary policy. The German mark was always under appreciation pressure because the southern European countries, they always had high inflation and depreciated the currencies and so on. And because the German mark was always under appreciation pressure, the German enterprises were always under pressure to increase efficiency and came up with innovative products. Yeah? And that's the very reason why the north of Europe created substantial productivity gains, which then could be distributed in form of a higher wage level for the citizens of Northern Europe, and also in form of transfers to Southern Europe. Yeah? And at the end of the day, everybody was better off. Yeah? A substantial part of the productivity gains of the North remained in the North, and part of it went to the South, and the South used it to buy Northern European products. Yeah? And we could go to Italy and have a cheap holiday. So everybody was happy in this currency competition process. Now with the euro area, and that was indeed a goal of the French, if I understand right, to end this currency competition process and to end the humiliation of the French franc by the German mark. but now linked to the monetary policy of the ECB, which is not anymore a German type monetary policy as embedded in the treaty, it's an Italian type monetary policy, and therefore the productivity gains are gone. Yeah, probably they are negative, but the expectation of the South, the transfers of the North are coming to the South, is still there. Yeah, they regard it as quite clear that the North will send funds to the South, and I think if this continues for a longer time period, there will be restrictions, because the wage level in the eastern part of Germany is already extremely low, yeah, and the people get nervous. In the western part it's still higher, but if it continues to go down, there will be an insight in the German government that this process cannot continue. And I don't know how long this will take. In the eastern part, the situation is unstable. In the western part, it's more stable, but we'll see how this will go on. But you know, the target balances in the context of the target balances, Germany has already transferred 1,200 billion euros to the south. That's quite a large amount, and we cannot go on to do this.
Náš čas sa pomaly blíži ku koncu. Ak má niekto záujem poslednú otázku, last question, tu uvidím, tam, last question.
Hello, my name is Tomáš, and I would like to ask if it's even possible for ECB to raise the interest rate about like very low level, like 1 or 2% without breaking the Eurozone or Europe economy.
Yeah, that's a nice question. I think that's the test. Yeah, that would be the test if the southern European countries want to stay in the monetary union or not. Yeah, so I wouldn't push anybody out of the European monetary union, but I would ask them to do the necessary in order to stay. Yeah, and if the ECB slowly starts to increase interest rates, there will be a choice for Italy. So either reform and bring the government expenditure under control and expose the enterprises to competition, or leave the monetary union. And if they leave the monetary union, they are able to depreciate the lira, and that will help the recovery and also revalue the debt of Italy. I personally think that Italy would be able to do the reforms, because the economic potential of Italy is very large, but they never will use this potential if it's easier to rely on funding from the Northern European countries, in specific Germany. Maybe some will drop out, like Greece and so on. But I think most countries would stay, and we would have a more resilient monetary union.
Takže náš čas sa už naozaj naplnil. Myslím si, že aj dnešná prednáška, diskusia potvrdila slova Friedricha Hayeka, že aj dnes potrebujeme hnutie slobodné peniaze, analogické hnutiu za slobodný obchod z 19. storočia, že naozaj je dôležité upozorňovať na vážnosť dôsledkov inflácie a aj na hĺbšie problémy týkajúce sa stagnácie, ktoré vyplývajú z podstaty menového systému, takže to je veľmi dôležité potom diskutovať, uvedomiť si tieto súvislosti. A pevne verím, že vás to obohatilo. Ja vám ďakujem všetkým za vašu účasť, za vašu diskusiu. Ešte raz chcem poďakovať partnerom za ich spoluprácu. A osobitne ďakujem pánovi profesorovi za jeho zaujímavú prednášku a vyčerpávajúce odpovede v diskusii. Thank you very much.